Game plans. You've got to have one, or do you? I mean, according to Rampage Jackson, the sport was better before everyone started using them. But even if it's not something you've been drilling all training camp, most fighters just have a preferred way to get the job done. Some like to use their wrestling, others like to avoid grappling at all costs and just try and knock you out. A couple of times though, we have seen certain fighters reverse the game plan on their opponent. So grapplers that have knocked out KO artists and strikers that have tapped submission experts. It's a pretty rare and weird phenomenon, which makes it all the more cooler when it does actually happen. I'm Balian from MML Point. Big shout out to all the guys who support us as MMA OP channel members, and this is 10 times fighters turn the game plan on their opponent. Now, I'm sure the first thing that comes to your mind is something like Gabriel Gonzaga head-kicking Crocop, right? He used the guy's signature move against him. Difference is, Gabriel was a knockout artist, so having a game plan to knock the other guy out, that's kind of to be expected. So today we want to talk about not only the fighters who used a strategy or a game plan that their opponent was good at, but it was also a strategy that you just never thought was going to work. Number 10, Jared Cannonier versus Marvin Vettori. Up in Alaska, the 7-0 undefeated streak of Jared Cannonier didn't go unnoticed. He even won the heavyweight title in AFC, and all throughout his heavyweight, light heavyweight, and then middleweight UFC career. After that, we saw him develop into a dynamic and explosive knockout artist. But when he went up against the champion Israel Adesanya, we saw that it just wasn't enough to truly be the best in the world, and he was perhaps just a bit too patient. At the same time, Marvin Vettori had done a similar thing in the UFC middleweight division, but with a completely different game plan: wrestling, pressure, and volume. That and his Terminator-like chin. Marvin had also come up short against the champ, and then both guys fought in an effort to get back into the title picture. The difference maker in most of Marvin's fights has usually been his wrestling and his ability to move forward and throw in volume, which is pretty much the complete opposite of Cannonier. But in this fight, Jared not only set a personal record in strikes thrown, as he was the one going forward non-stop, but he also scored 4 takedowns against the wrestler Vettori, and that was double the amount he'd landed in his previous 15 UFC fights. But he pretty much beat Marvin at his own game, and I don't think anyone saw that strategy coming. Number 9, George St. Pierre versus Josh Koscheck. At this point, there's going to be a lot of people watching this video who never saw George St. Pierre fight. You've probably seen other fighter careers though, and you'll know it's pretty hard to summarize the change that you see across a fighter in 10 years in a couple of sentences. Now, you'll probably know that George St. Pierre was one of the most dominant wrestlers in MMA history. But we didn't really know that at first. His karate striking had looked great and he'd scored some big knockouts, and we'd definitely seen he was good with his takedowns. But after that devastating upset loss to Matt Serra, GSP would have to face Josh Koscheck. And this guy was an NCAA Division I wrestler. It was then only after this fight that we knew just how good GSP's wrestling was, as he ran the Koscheck playbook, not only taking him down, but holding him down, with the American landing just 4 significant strikes.
He really brought it to Koscheck in a way that Koscheck wasn't expecting it. He out-wrestled the wrestler.
Name another guy in MMA who had even the balls to try and out-wrestle a collegiate guy like that, let alone pull it off. It was truly a leveling up moment from GSP, and no one doubted his wrestling ever again after that. Moral of the story, GSP was the shit, basically. Number 8, Randy Couture versus Chuck Liddell. Right, let's go even further back now in time to some of the greats who helped get this sport going. And they don't come much more decorated than Randy, do they? World champion in the UFC 5 different times and in 2 different weight classes. The first time he was ever actually beaten in the UFC octagon for his title was against a very young Josh Barnett, who immediately tested positive for banned substances and was stripped. Randy then had a chance to win the belt back, but immediately lost to Rico Rodriguez. And after that, it was time for Randy to drop down to 205, a division that had been flourishing under the reign of Tito Ortiz. But there was one man Tito just didn't want to fight: Chuck Liddell, the Iceman, on a 7-fight UFC win streak. This guy was a devastating KO artist, perhaps the best around, and against Randy, everyone expected the wrestling to play a big part, and for Couture to keep the fight either against the cage or on the mat as much as possible. But that guy went out there and started boxing up the striker.
Randy Couture aggressively striking. Never in my dreams did I think Randy Couture would be controlling the stand-up.
The last thing anyone thought was going to happen was that Randy would go toe-to-toe and try and beat him on the feet. Number 7, Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal. Coming out of a global pandemic, the UFC fan base was starved for any kind of arena show to get us feeling a little bit back to normal. Florida turned out to be the place in America to open its doors first, and the show was headlined by two guys that train in the Sunshine State going head to head. The dominant champion Kamaru Usman and the guy who grew up street fighting there, Jorge Masvidal.
We can't stand together, and he knows it, you know? He's gonna come to hug me and try to put me in the fence, but it's not gonna work.
You guys know what I bring to the table. I'm gonna knock this motherfucker out.
After getting some confidence in his striking ability, we saw the wrestler Kamaru swing it out with the street fighting veteran and knock him completely unconscious.
Holy smoke! Oh my goodness! Closed! We have never seen that!
Pretty much the opposite of what we thought was going to happen. Number 6, Juliana Pena versus Amanda Nunes. The first season of The Ultimate Fighter to feature women we knew would give us fighters that would go on to make up the division for a long time to come. So a girl like Juliana Pena, who ran through all her competition and went on to win the show, was looked at as a potential future champion. She had one thing going for her that stood out above a lot of the girls in the division, and it was her grappling, her submissions, and her takedowns. She then had a bit of an up and down career though, and finally got a title shot in 2022 after nearly 10 years of campaigning for one. The champion Amanda Nunes had basically beaten everyone across 2 different weight classes at this point, and although she was a well-rounded MMA fighter, her knockouts speak for themselves. She was a devastating KO artist. Everyone expected when they fought, if there was any way Pena was gonna win, it was gonna be with her grappling. Of course, once the bell sounded, Juliana got hit with those power shots and kept coming forward, making it a slugfest that she got the better of. Amanda had gone toe-to-toe with legendary fighters like Chris Cyborg and come out on top, but Pena totally used that against her. It did end in a submission, but it was a crazy striking game plan from Julie that got the job done. Number 5, Paulo Costa versus Luke Rockhold. I know Costa supposedly has a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. I mean, he's bragged about it when he fought Izzy.
I will make him cry.
But when have you seen him take anyone down? Like, ever? In 8 UFC fights, he's shot just 1 takedown, and in all that time, he only spent about 90 seconds in top position. Luke Rockhold, though, who's used his grappling to pick up 8 submission wins against a lot of high-level opposition, had this to say.
But, I mean, I think I'm the best grappler in MMA. I don't think anybody competes with me in this game on the ground. I will kill him on the ground. There's no chance.
Well, he was right. The ground game would play into this fight, but not in the kind of way that we all expected. I mean, even the commentators knew going in that was probably going to be the strategy for Luke.
No doubt.
And if he can get this fight to the ground, you got to give Rockhold the advantage in the grapple.
Rockhold even tried to take him down early, but Costa stuffed it and surprisingly got a takedown of his own and started dropping ground and pound and controlled the first round.
Wow, Costa takes Luke down.
By the end of the second round though, both guys were knackered and it was looking close, but once again in the third round, it was Costa who controlled from top position, even if Luke did reverse and get to rub it in his face right at the end. It ended up 30-27 on the scorecards, all of them for Costa, with about 6 minutes of top control. I mean, the grappling did play a big part, an area everyone, and definitely Luke, thought he would dominate. Number 4, Fabricio Verdum versus Mark Hunt. These two MMA heavyweights are almost complete opposites of each other. One went through the very traditional Gracie Jiu-Jitsu system, the other learnt the oceanic ways of kickboxing. They've both even won world championships in sports outside of MMA, but after some ups and downs in 2011, both men found themselves in the UFC and somehow on a run to the title. Verdum had just lost to Alistair Overeem in Strikeforce with a terrible flop down on his back game plan, and Mark had just come over from Pride on the back of an awful losing streak. Still, 3 years later, and both men would be in for a chance to win UFC interim heavyweight gold when they squared off in Mexico. Now, Mark was filling in on short notice and had also struggled to make weight. More than anything, he needed to keep the fight standing. Verdum had a plethora of submission techniques, and the best option seemed obvious: tap the Samoan. But it was won by Fabricio with his striking. Now, he was even dropped in the first round before setting up a flying knee KO in the second, knocking out a K1 champion, and his MMA career came full circle from a guy that would pull guard. Number 3, Nick Diaz versus Robbie Lawler. This fight has become such an iconic moment, the meeting of two future legends super early in both their careers, and it's achieved true cult status. Now, Robbie Lawler had been tearing up UFC competition as a super young and super aggressive striker, just knocking out everybody. Nick had just won the first ever WEC welterweight championship before getting a phone call from the UFC who thought he'd make a great matchup against Lawler. Mainly because it was going to be a striker versus a jiu-jitsu guy. I mean, that was how Nick won his WEC title and his UFC debut, and he had a black belt under a Gracie, so yeah, that's what everyone thought he was good at. But then he went in there with Robbie Lawler and started piecing him up with his boxing. He knocked Lawler out and made a total star of himself with the performance that night, and a big reason was because he beat Robbie at his own game.
I do a lot of boxing. I try to sell it, you know, just because it says jiu-jitsu on my clothes. It's my life, it's what I do.
Number 2, Kevin Randleman versus Mirko Cro Cop. Now, I know some of you probably assumed Cro Cop Gonzaga was going to be in this video, and of course, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I won't hold it against you, but I think Randleman is a much more interesting story. The monster, as he became known, Kevin Randleman, was an extremely decorated collegiate wrestler who got into the UFC in the very early days and went on to win the heavyweight championship. He went over to Japan where he was allowed to use knees on the ground and had a ton of success, but lost in a title eliminator in Pride to Rampage Jackson. After that, though, they gave him the People's Champion Sakuraba, but he lost via armbar, and for Kevin, at this point, it looked like things might be winding down. I mean, he'd been competing for 8 years and was 14-7. Of course, if there's one thing that's going to turn your career around, it's winning the heavyweight Grand Prix in Pride, and in 2004, he jumped into the tournament and got Mirko Cro Cop in the opening round. Now, the Croatian kickboxer had only just arrived in Pride, and although he'd already head-kicked a bunch of people, he'd lost in the title fight to the grappler Antonio Nogueira. So going into the fight, it was pretty clear that, hey, Randleman, you gotta take this guy down or you're gonna suffer your 5th knockout loss. But instead of getting him to the canvas, Kevin would fake a takedown and instead KO the kickboxing champion.
Let's go!
Mirko had never been knocked out in MMA, and now it had come from a wrestler. Number 1, Jorge Masvidal versus Michael Chiesa. I know we all thought of Masvidal as a veteran by the time he was fighting for the BMF, and that was a whole part of his cult appeal as a fighter, but I mean, even when making his UFC debut, he was already 30 fights into his MMA career. Now, he'd obviously got recognition for his street fighting videos with Kimbo Slice, but he'd also been to Strikeforce, where he fought for the title, Bellator, I mean, all over, really, where he gained recognition as a dangerous striker and had 10 wins by knockout.
And again, Masvidal goes to work. Oh, big right hand! It's good night, Irene!
In just his second UFC fight, though, Jorge was given Michael Chiesa, the undefeated Ultimate Fighter winner who had won all but one of his fights by submission and had even won the finale of the show in the same way. Now, it seems like a pretty simple case of can Masvidal keep it on the feet and strike, or will Chiesa take him down and get the submission? Well, actually, it was Mike who first dropped Jorge, and so it kind of looked like Chiesa was going to be the guy to turn the game plan on his opponent. In the end, though, it was Jorge who decided to go to the ground with Mike, where he eventually submitted him.
Jorge Masvidal! Beautiful job. Winner by submission.
Mike had been undefeated, never been submitted, and Masvidal had only got 1 submission in 30 fights so far. Unbelievable. Of course, a lot of us forgot all about that until about 12 fights later when Masvidal fought Damian Maia, and he called him...
Actually, he's one of the best jiu-jitsu fighters that I ever fought in the UFC.
Right, there you have it. Is there a better way to win an MMA fight than to beat someone at their own game? Big shout out to Max Randall. Thank you for editing another video. Good sir, your talents are graciously appreciated. Follow him here on social media at Max_Randall, or check out his new channel, The Combat Arcade. All you Hall of Famers out there, we appreciate you. Thank you for going the extra mile to support the channel. We know what you like. You like unedited podcasts and access to the writers' meeting. You like that as well? Well, you can join them for $2.99. If you want to see more from us, guys, give us a thumbs up. That's always very much appreciated, but subscribing is the way to get notified of all the upcoming videos. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, guys. Appreciate you. I will see you in the next one. Front kick. Bah!